Good evening. My name is Luciana Gama Muniz. I am project director at the Brazilian Center for International Relations. It is a pleasure to be here today sharing this screen with our very, very special guests. I would like to welcome and to thank you for being here with us tonight. Brian Winter, Vice President of the American Society, Council of the Americas, and Editor-in-Chief of the Americas Quarterly. Thank you, Brian, for joining us tonight. Professor Monica Hers, who is also Senior Fellow at CEBRI and Professor at the Institute of International Relations at PUC-Rio. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, Monica. And Cecilia Tornaghi, our moderator for the evening. Cecilia is Managing Editor at Americas Quarterly, and she will be leading us to tonight's discussion. I also would like to give a very special thanks to our audience. This is the closing conference of the project America in the World, the US Foreign Policy and the Brazilian View on the Bilateral Agenda. This project is a partnership between CEBRI's United States program and the Consulate General of the United States in Rio de Janeiro. On behalf of CEBRI, of course, I would like to give a very, very special thank you to the support of the Consulate in the development of this very important initiative that we've been developing along the two last years. I would also like to give a very special thanks to Ambassador Sergio Amaral. He is one of CEBRI's trustees, and he's the leader of CEBRI's United States program and also the leader of this project. Unfortunately, Ambassador Amaral won't be able to join us tonight anymore, but we owe him the success of this project in partnership with CEBRI and the consulate teams that have been working very hard to put all these initiatives together. So thank you so much to Ambassador Amaral and CEBRI's and the consulate teams. So as I said before, since last year, we have been developing a series of dialogues in order to raise awareness and offer academic and strategic insights on the existing convergences and opportunities for increasing the cooperation in the foreign policy of both countries. And we've been doing these dialogues with a very specific focus on 4 areas of the bilateral agenda. The first one is multilateralism and international organization, international trade, climate emergency and environmental justice, and also the triangular relationship between Brazil, the United States, and China. So with this closing conference, we held a total of 10 events, and we believe we have been promoting reflections, insights, and helped to connect representatives from public and private sectors, academic and civil society from Brazil and the United States to foster bilateral dialogue and cooperation between these two countries. So please make sure you check CEBRI's website to catch up on the previous events. And we will also be launching soon the reports of these projects on our site. Finally, I also would like to give a very special thanks to Americas Quarterly for partnering with us in this event. And without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Brian Winter for his initial remarks. Please, Brian, the floor is yours and you have around 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Boa tarde a todos. Obrigado, Luciana. Obrigado, CEBRI, pelo convite. It's a real pleasure to be with all of you this evening. I am sure you would all agree that the timing of today's event could not be better. The life of a Brasilianista is never boring, but the last few weeks have been particularly interesting, let's say, reflective of dynamics that have characterized the U.S.-Brazil relationship over the last 20 years or more. Some of these dynamics are old. Some of them are new. We have also just published at America's Quarterly today a new issue on Brazil's foreign policy. You can see the cover here over my shoulder. I have personally been following the U.S.-Brazil relationship for more than 20 years now. First as a reporter who lived in Sao Paulo for 5 years under a previous Workers' Party government, and now in my current role at AQ, which Luciana mentioned. I have to say, I am not a diplomat. I'm a journalist, now an analyst who has lived in both countries, has a real love for both countries. I always try to speak clearly, directly, but also from a position of respect, understanding the reality and the perspectives in both of these countries. So that all said, if I had to focus on one overarching trend right now that begins to explain the U.S.-Brazil relationship, I would say that it's Brazil's search for a multipolar world and the U.S. reaction to that search. Brazil's quest for a multipolar world is not new. It characterized Lula's first government, which of course pursued reform of the UN Security Council. It oversaw the establishment of the BRICS. It opened embassies in Africa and generally pursued an expansion of South-South ties. All of this, and I know that this is all known to this audience, but rooted in the belief that Brazil would benefit from a world order in which there was not just one hegemon, i.e. the United States. But the world has continued to change in the past 20 years, specifically the rising importance of China, which now receives more Brazilian exports than the US and the European Union combined. The other sort of new or accelerating trend is the rising strategic competition between Beijing and Washington. And all of these factors have made Brazil, especially now under Lula's, now that Lula's back in charge, has made Brazil more keen to pursue a non-aligned strategy in search of a more multipolar world. In clear terms, Brazil wants to avoid getting drawn into a new Cold War because the first one brought negative consequences, not just for Brazil, but certainly much of Latin America and much of the rest of the world as well. And Brazil and many other countries are in fact hoping to benefit from a superpower competition, as evidenced by the comparisons that have happened, not just in the Brazilian press, but, and I know this from having recently spent time in Brasilia, as well as in Sao Paulo and Rio, all three of which I visited last month. Lots of comparisons going on between Lula's recent trip to the White House in February and his time in China just now. And what everyone talks about is the fact that Lula walked away from Washington with commitments worth about $50 million, that's million with an M, and left Beijing with commitments worth approximately $10 billion with a B. And even if those don't all come to fruition, I think we can assume that that will add up to more than $50 million when it's all said and done. I have heard senior members of the Brazilian political establishment say in recent years that Brazil needs to pursue a policy with regard to this current moment in line with what Getúlio Vargas did back in the beginnings of World War II, when, of course, Brazil did eventually enter the war on the Allied side, but not before conducting negotiations with both sides and coming out of that process with U.S. agreement to essentially provide capital and know-how that seeded the beginnings of a U.S. steel industry. This idea of non-alignment is, in other words, very deeply seated in the Brazilian diplomatic mentality, and from a kind of realpolitik perspective, at least, it makes sense. This strategy is often poorly understood in Washington by people in both parties, actually, who see Brazil's pursuit of a more multipolar world as anti-Americanism sometimes. Sometimes it is, or at least there are hints of anti-Americanism, but sometimes it's not. Some of these people, I'm not just referring to people in government, but elsewhere, have trouble getting beyond the 20th century framework of Brazil and Latin America being part of the U.S. Sphere of influence. I mean, it is true that even in the 21st century, we still have people in the U.S. national security community who in recent years have defended the Monroe Doctrine, which this year, by the way, is 200 years old. There is a failure to understand sometimes that non-alignment can be seen not as anti-Americanism, but as a coherent pursuit of Brazil's national interest, considering its commercial ties, its recent history, and the current state of the world. After all, I would point out, Brazil is not alone in this pursuit. Virtually every other major government in Latin America is seeking some sort of middle ground between Washington and Beijing. It's not even really an issue of left or right. Some of the most ardent defenders of a middle path between the superpowers in recent years have been governments on the right, such as Sebastián Piñera in Chile, Mauricio Macri in Argentina, and Iván Duque in Colombia, all of whom were energetic proponents of more Chinese investment and engagement. The fact that Latin America is looking like a non-aligned group of nations in this global moment is starting to sink in. In fact, in the International Monetary Fund report that was issued last week, there's a whole chapter dedicated to what might happen to the global economy if there is a fragmentation in the next few years between a Chinese sphere of influence and a US sphere of influence. And in the IMF's base case accounting for what this scenario might look like, there are only two groupings of nations that they listed as likely to remain in a truly independent stance. The first grouping was India and Indonesia. I don't know, by the way, why they put those two nations together, but they did. And the second grouping was Latin America and the Caribbean. But in practice, the theory of trying to stay non-aligned or equidistant is difficult. Some even say that it's impossible. And I think recent episodes illustrate that. Interestingly, President Lula's recent trip to China was less controversial than his comments that he made while there on the Ukraine war, which clearly stepped beyond the realm of multipolarity by essentially repeating Russia's narrative about the war itself, saying that Zelensky and Putin shared equal responsibility for the war, and also saying that the main problem was that the US and Europe were incentivizing the war through arms sales and other means. It was the word sobretudo that Lula used above all, that when he was talking about the US and Europe, that really fueled a lot of the controversy. The damage in Washington from these comments was considerable. It appears to have been worse in Europe. It fed the view that Brazil's government is not a committed partner on issues like democracy, territorial integrity, and more, and that this government may be inclined to, rather than to take a multipolar stance, may be inclined to take the side actively of China and Russia on the big issues of the day. I saw that there was reporting in the European press suggesting that the episode could make the EU-Mercosur trade deal approval more difficult, and that it could also stand in the way of further contributions from European nations to the Amazon Fund. Likewise, I think in the United States, I think it's possible that this episode will make it more difficult in practice for the administration to add another $450 million to the Amazon Fund, keeping in mind that that is money that must be approved by the US Congress. So, in conclusion, where does that leave us today? I think it's a delicate moment for the US-Brazil relationship. On the one hand, it is a big, complex, nuanced relationship with many areas of strategic interest that are going to continue almost no matter what. I think that anyone who watches both the interests as well as the personal dynamics of this relationship knows, for example, that President Biden and President Lula actually had a very good meeting when they were together back in February. That is very clear. On the other hand, I know that there have been some recent moves by the Lula government to perhaps backpedal a bit from some of what was said, particularly about Ukraine. But there's pressure on both sides. I think that on the other hand, There's pressure on Washington, on the Biden administration, to show that Brazil matters, not just with words, but with money, as well as collaboration on some of the issues that I know we want to talk about on this panel today, including the Amazon, international trade, Latin American integration, and so on. So with those initial remarks, thank you again for having me, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Brian. Now I'd like to invite Professor Monica to the dialogue.
First, I would like to start by thanking CEBRI for the invitation. And also, it is a great pleasure to be here with the AQ team, which I very greatly admire. And I feel very passionate about this discussion, particularly since I voted for both presidents. So I'm very, very keen on discussing the prospects for cooperation between the US and Brazil in the current context. And in spite of the events regarding the war in Ukraine that Brian mentioned, I think we can move beyond that quite easily. I would suggest that we look at this relationship in the context of the relationship between Latin America and the US. Of course, there are many different ways of looking at this relationship, but I would like to make this proposition. And I would also like to make the proposition that there are two processes, or if you want, tendencies taking place in Latin America, but of course, not only in Latin America, in the world at large, that I think we should consider in order to put forward some ideas about how this relationship can move forward. I would like to point your attention to, of course, two things that you know very well, but perhaps it's an idea to think of them together. Brian mentioned the systemic dispute between the US and China. This, of course, involves Russia as well. The systemic dispute has, during the last 20 years, but particularly during the last 10 years, been quite visible in our region. I have written about this one specific aspect of actually this dispute, which is the South Atlantic. And though I am usually more interested in security, in this case, I am not going to talk about security. And I would like us to think about this contest in a broader frame in terms of a political contest. Of course, it's an economic contest, it's a geopolitical contest, it's multidimensional. And it became such an acute mark of the relationship between the US and Latin America, and such an acute mark of the insertion of Latin America in global politics, that we can't even start our conversation without taking this into account. And of course, we all know about the commercial, investment, infrastructural aspects of the relationship, but I would call your attention to the soft power and cultural aspects of the relationship as well, in terms of investment in Confucius centers, the presence of Chinese community in the region, the tourism. There are so many different aspects of this relationship that has been changing. I mean, I think the way particularly Latin American elites, but not only Latin American elites, look at China, think of China, consider Chinese experiences in their own decision-making processes has changed dramatically in practically every country in the region. The way we watch television, the way we watch Chinese produced television in Spanish, this all has changed immensely. At the same time that we are looking at this geopolitical dispute and its implications in different dimensions in our region, we are also seeing a decline of democracy, crisis of democracy. So this is the second tendency or process that I would like to call your attention to. We may be optimistic now in Brazil that we have a government committed to liberal democratic principles, but still what we see, if you look at a broad picture of Latin America, is that the de-democratization processes taking place in so many parts of the world are most definitely also taking place here. It's very different in different countries. And we have, of course, dramatic cases such as Venezuela. Look at what's happening in El Salvador. Look at the political crisis in Peru. So there is an institutional aspect to this crisis. I mean, you look at liberal democratic institutions and see that they are in crisis. They're being attacked with very similar processes as those taking place in other countries. Leaders are elected in processes that are more or less democratic, and then they themselves are the agents of the destruction of these institutions. You can look at the situation in Guatemala. You can look at the institutional fragility in Ecuador. I mean, we can go on and on with this. At the same time, you have situations in the region where the rise of the radical right or extreme right is quite visible. I'm working on a research on this specific subject, and of course, these frontiers are not always very clear. But you look at the rise and the active presence of actors, not only political parties and leaders, but also other actors that clearly are not committed to liberal democratic principles. Of course, this can happen on the left also, but mostly today I would say that the threat comes from the right in Latin America. And also, as many researchers have been showing, we have a decline in trust in institutions, a decline in trust in democratic institutions and in democracy itself. So we're dealing with these two processes taking place in the region, and of course taking place in the US as well, right? So this is, and my question is, how do they interact, and how do they interact regarding specifically the relationship between Brazil and the US and Latin America? Is the US able to produce a policy towards the region where the support for democracy in the many different ways that democracy can be supported is actually thought of in terms of this systemic dispute? And what does it mean to think of the support for democracy, not as we thought of it in the early 2000s, late 90s, the time of the Democratic Charter, 2001. And this is a completely different moment. So how can we bring back this debate to the table? And how can it be part of the systemic dispute? And I would argue that this can only be interesting and profitable for the relationship between Brazil and the US, or Latin America and the US, if we think in terms of a variable architecture and not one sole architecture. We have to open the box of this relationship. Think in terms of the possibilities of support for democracy at some moments and other moments when it is not possible. I think it was a mistake not to have Cuba, Venezuela, and other countries at the summit in the US. And so there are moments, again, there are relations, geographic relations, when democracy and the support for democracy should be upfront. There are other moments when this shouldn't be the core issue. Then there are institutional settings where we can also have multiple architectures. So maybe there are some institutional settings when it is very interesting to focus on the support for democracy. And maybe there are some other institutional settings where it is necessary to move this subject a bit to the side. And my vision is that the American government, the Biden administration, because of course this was not an issue for the Trump administration, the Biden administration, and also Latin American countries have a difficulty in grasping this possibility of complexity, which is what I'm trying to put on the table. So for instance, regarding the war in the Ukraine, I think it is pity that it was framed by the American government as a fight for democracy. I think it should have been framed from the beginning as a fight for the norm of territorial integrity. And we would have a much wider coalition. And it would have been, and every time that the Lula government moves, they move towards criticizing the US and supporting Russia, and then they move back, and they sort of move back and forward, right? And every time they move back, and in the sense of criticizing the Russian invasion, they focus on the territorial integrity norm, which is so precious and well respected, not only in Brazil, but in the global South more generally. Does this mean the US cannot support democracy in the Ukraine or in Russia or in some other country? Yes, it can. Of course it can. Does this mean I think that the war in the Ukraine is not related to the defense of democracy in the Ukraine? No, I do think it's related to the defense of democracy in the Ukraine. But what do you put on the table, in which forums, in which moment, in which geography? I think that is what we should be discussing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica. Cecilia, now the floor is yours. Please join us to the debate.
This is fantastic. So much food for thought. Yeah, like where to start from these two, like very interesting perspectives looking regionally and directly to the relationship. I just want to remind everyone watching us to please send your questions. You can send questions. I'll try to get to as many as we can as we go. And I do want to try to, from what you said, also relate to the 4 topics that were mentioned at this project look, because I think they are also very telling and a photography of what this really, the potential and the obstacles for this relationship. So then, since we are in the Ukraine discussion and both of you have raised, so let's go there, because the relationship, this triangle that Luciana had mentioned earlier, is now pretty much under this light, this spotlight of the Ukraine war and what President Lula has said in his positioning around not only Ukraine, but worse, really, or seen worse in the West by how he put in the position of the US as supporting the war, incentivizing the war. So given that, and Monica, you're saying that looking from the perspective of original perspective, there is a lot of other areas to go, but the matter of the fact is the US did place this discussion as a democracy fight, and also the same for the Summit of the Americas. So given that these two countries are speaking different languages, right, at this point, one is talking about integrity, the other about saving democracy, and there is this elephant in the room, which is the relationship to China, whether Brazil is or isn't mimicking or parroting the position of the other side. So how does that taint or can Brazil actually be neutral and forward this change in this dialogue with the US, given these words? We saw that after what he said, Biden did sign 500 million support for the Amazon fund, which is kind of an interesting timing. But how do you see, under this perspective that you're putting, this effort for Brazil to actually continue neutral, or is it a done deal here that Brazil can't claim that it's staying neutral in this discussion?
I think that non-alignment is different. Should be differentiated in terms of neutrality. Neutrality and non-alignment are two different things. And in terms of the war in the Ukraine, if you look at the actions, at the decisions made by the Brazilian government, I don't think it shows neutrality. They have voted for many resolutions criticizing the invasion. And in many, many different moments, Brazilian diplomats and even President Lula have criticized the invasion. So I think that trying to position themselves in a manner that allows them to move within the Chinese sphere, within the Russian sphere, within BRICS, you have to remember that BRICS is a priority for this government. So it puts it in a very difficult position regarding this war. I do think that that non-alignment with one of these blocks, as Brian has mentioned regarding the IMF report, is the option taken. This does not mean that the country is neutral in terms of both countries were responsible for this war, though I know that this has been said. But if you look at the pattern of behavior of this government since it came to power at the beginning of the year, I don't think it is a pattern of a neutral country. I think it is a pattern of a country searching for a space within this non-aligned political space. Just searching at this point. We don't know, it's very, very early. We don't know what will be possible. So I would try to be careful about that. Remember also that there are many tensions and contradictions between China and Russia. This is absolutely not an easy relationship. And we should remember Henry Kissinger try to work with this a little bit more, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, that border over there is not exactly a simple one or an easy one. And Brian, good back to you on this, still on this topic, but the CEBRI project, actually, one of the findings was that Brazil was suggested that countries in the global south, with Brazil included, could act to pressure the US and China to find interfaces of cooperation. Now we have this current situation with how Brazil is positioned, what you mentioned, that the US is not understanding Brazil's vision of multipolar, or what it positions itself regarding a multipolar world. And then also, I mean, Lula is a founder of the BRICS, so he is not in a position to actually break this grouping right now. So with that, this finding or this thought that Brazil could be or could help US and China to find its a cooperation line, given the current scenario, how do you see that, and what would you suggest?
Thank you for the question, and thank you, Monica, by the way, for all of your comments. It's been fascinating to listen to, and it's a pleasure to share this panel with you. Look, I was part of a group here in the United States, and I have to say a pretty small group, who believed that there was a role for Brazil and for President Lula to play potentially on the Ukraine question. To me, having a country of Brazil's size and importance, and also having somebody of Lula's stature, his charisma, and also his knowledge of policy, which I have found that not only within Brazil, but elsewhere in the world, people tend to underestimate his ability to really get into the details on a wide variety of issues. I've always had a personal admiration for his policy knowledge. And so I thought that there might be some role for him to play. My personal belief, based on conversations that I've had over the last, I guess, 10 days or so, is that whatever opportunity there was for Brazil to play a role in that question is now gone. I don't see how, even with these efforts to, for example, send Ambassador Celso Amorim potentially to Ukraine, some of the statements that have been made over the last couple of days to perhaps add a bit of nuance to what President Lula said. I'm not sure that there's a good way to take those comments back. I think that an impression has been made throughout the West, throughout not just Western Europe, but Eastern Europe, where, according to some people, the reaction was even more negative. And, that's beyond what I would want. That's what I'm hearing about kind of the current state of things, is that it would now be very difficult, if not impossible, for Brazil to play a meaningful role in that discussion. So, and that's on Ukraine. I'm not sure which subject is more complicated, Ukraine or the US-China question, but they're both extremely complicated issues and would involve some very delicate diplomacy. I want to, just before we get to the next question, I address something that Monica said and has been kind of coursing throughout this discussion, which is this idea about the way the Biden administration sees the democracy versus autocracy question, which is a way that they have consistently kind of defined their worldview. And look, I have lived 9 years of my life in Latin America. I am also a reader of history, and I know that framing strikes many people in the region as naive, or even hypocritical when you consider not only the US's past, but also its present. But I think in practice, it's a viewpoint that is driven by two things that are deeply held in the United States, and particularly in this administration. The first one is our own experience with Monica, which Monica referenced, in which our democracy was in danger at several junctures in recent years, including on January 6, 2021. I think that for domestic reasons, I think it's interesting for President Biden, advantageous for President Biden to frame things in that manner. And then the second factor is that the national security establishment in Washington sees this competition between US and China as the defining characteristic of the 21st century. And that inevitably bleeds into policy towards Latin America as well. We have a podcast at America's Quarterly. A couple of months ago, I interviewed Juan Gonzalez. Juan is the head of Latin America policy for the National Security Council, in other words, for the White House. And I asked him if there was a Biden doctrine towards Latin America. And he said, well, if there's a Biden doctrine, and I'm going to paraphrase, but I think I'm going to get this quote pretty close. He said the Biden doctrine towards Latin America is that it is in the US national security interest to support democracy in Latin America. And that's interesting because it's, again, for those of us who read history, it has not always been the case. In fact, it was not the case recently. I think it's fair to say that democracy was not a main consideration with the Trump administration's policy towards the region. And it explains the priority that they gave to not only receiving President Lula very early in his term, but also receiving Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, who is a complex figure in sort of the US political context. There are a lot of people in DC who don't like him, who believe that he's taking Colombia in a in a more, to quote them, not my view, but taking Colombia in a more anti-US direction. But the Biden administration's position is that he is the democratically elected leader of the country, and therefore it's important to support him. It also explains why the White House recently hosted Alberto Fernandez, who is extremely unpopular and has just announced that he will not be seeking a second term. And a fair person might ask, why did the White House spend time hosting a lame duck Argentine president who only has something like 20% support at home? The answer, again, as I understand it, is that this is one of the strongest democracies in Latin America, and therefore an important voice to support. So, I do think that with this administration, there's been they have, especially in Latin America, kind of not only talked the talk, but walked the walk when it comes to supporting democracy. The question, and I'll conclude with this, and Monica, I think you kind of referenced this, the question is whether it would survive the Biden administration. I mean, if we see a Republican president elected next year, and especially if that president is Donald Trump, would this commitment to democracy remain central in U.S. policy towards the region? I think that's a fair question to ask.
Fair question.
Can I just say something about this? Yeah, because I of course have the same concern as Brian. So I would stress how important it is for institutions, multilateral institutions in the region to be built. Not only because there is a tendency to think that the OAS is, there is always a tension between the OAS as an institution and Latin American institutions like UNASUR or CELAC. And I don't see it in that way. I think that multilateral institutions, whether they're South American, hemispheric, or Latin America, can play a role if the proper investment is made as supporters of democracy, even when you have let's say de-democratization processes within one country, even if this is a relevant, powerful country. So I would stress that from the point of view of both Lula and Biden, it makes sense to have pillars of support for democracy within multilateral institutions, and not only within, I mean, of course, civil society is absolutely crucial, and even within, market actors, it's absolutely crucial. This is a multidimensional process, but I would like to stress how it is important to have multilateral institutions that can actually move and support democracy in situations where governments are really not interested in the subject. And I would also like to add, in terms of the Biden administration, not only what Brian said in terms of talking to whoever was elected in an extremely respectful and friendly way, but also building back better world, right? Having, though I don't think the proper investment has been made, but there is this perspective that democracy and development have to come together, and these investments have to be made together.
And a question here is then by what you both have put, whether, considering multilaterals and the shared experience that these two presidents had, the fact that they both came on the heels of controversial, let's put it this way, governments, and how much that influences their decisions on their, bilateral relationship, on actually bonding among these prior experience, and if that will translate in actual support from the US, for instance, for the pledges that Brazil keeps making on multilaterals, for larger presence of the global South and Latin America itself on the Security Council, the fixing the WTO. So is that enough, this goodwill and their shared experience? Is that a bonding that they need, or what else is needed for these two countries to actually collaborate in the multilateral, fixing the multilateral relationships and the existing institutions? Monica, do you want to start on that one?
I think it depends which aspect of multilateral institutions you're talking about. I think they can collaborate in terms of rebuilding and working on the human rights protection institutions, the council and other aspects of protecting human rights that the UN system does, and that, of course, regional organizations can also do. In the economic and commercial spheres, it is, of course, much, much more difficult. And I'll let Brian speak about that, because that's really not my sphere, though, of course, there are so many contradictions and very, very antagonistic interests. I think that you should also consider the possibility of greater cooperation, and I think that it does exist in the security sphere. So, not necessarily in mediating the war in the Ukraine, but let's say in terms of arms control and disarmament, in terms of safety measures regarding nuclear issues, regarding peace operations. I think there are other spheres in which, yes, their common experience can lead them to greater cooperation. The economic sphere, of course, it is much more complicated.
Brian, if you want to weigh on that, and also, how realistic is that Brazil would actually achieve this pledge, or this goal of an increased voice in these larger global multilateral institutions?
Well, I think there are lots of areas where Brazil can still lead. I mean, to be clear, I think it's now effectively fenced out of the Ukraine discussion, as I said, and I don't think it's in a position to be a mediator on the U.S.-China conflict. But look, it's a big world. There are so many important issues right now. And climate is an area where Brazil has obvious ability to lead, not just at a regional level, but at a global level. I mean, this is part of the argument for why, maybe Ukraine was just kind of a distraction, investing all this time and energy and sort of running the risk of playing on, the stage that is arguably one of the world's biggest issues right now, when there are so many other things where Brazil's so much better positioned, not only on climate and stewardship of the Amazon, while, of course, prioritizing and respecting Brazil's sovereignty, but also, it's not unthinkable that Brazil could play a role in mediating the crises that we see caused by the dictatorships in Venezuela and Nicaragua. That's another area where Brazil could potentially lead. Cecilia, you asked earlier if, goodwill was enough. And I think that this question of how can the United States in these relationships, not just with Brazil, but elsewhere around Latin America, how can it compete with China, is a question that is not only being asked right now in Washington, but in capitals all over the region. I was just in Chile and Argentina last week, and those are the questions that people are asking there as well. It's like, where is the United States? You sometimes hear this view. Let me say what it is and then take a bit of distance. I mean, you hear this phrase from policymakers all over the region, and people say, well, we would rather work with the United States, but we just feel like we're not getting any engagement, any resources from the US right now, and that leaves us with no alternative but to go, see what opportunities await us in China. Is that something that people say to people like me, Americans who are kind of in this space? It's possible. And so, you can sort of evaluate, you can use your own good judgment to evaluate the credibility of that statement. But some people, I think, I've heard it often enough that I think some people mean it. The problem that Washington has is that, unlike Beijing, the US government is not capable of ordering companies to go and invest sometimes for non-economic reasons, for geopolitical reasons, for strategic reasons, or for an investment that might take 10, 20, or 30 years to pay off in the way that China obviously can. It's also true that the US is handicapped right now by something that is very new in its modern history, that has never happened in my lifetime before. And that is the fact that we have two parties, our only two parties of note in Washington, who do not believe in new free trade agreements. That has traditionally been one of the main tools that the US has for increasing engagement and strategic partnerships with other countries around the region. And it is a completely new development that essentially traces its roots back to Donald Trump's election in 2016, that both parties are kind of, or at least the leadership in those parties, are kind of scared of that right now. Donald Trump, of course, was protectionist, but Joe Biden has his Buy American program, which in practice is not that different. So, there's lots of people trying to think up creative ideas for the US to not only, sort of say nice things and create room at multilateral forums and elsewhere, but to also, show countries like Brazil the money. Some of these ideas include a capital increase for the Inter-American Development Bank, perhaps more resources for an organization like the Organization of American States. I'm not sure. But, if without that kind of creative thinking, there's reason to believe that we'll continue to see visit after visit where countries walk away from China with a number that starts with B, and the US is still, dealing with a word that starts with M, with millions instead of billions.
And we're getting quite a few questions here, so I want to get to some of these questions, but a couple of them actually bring us to the other topic that you breached now with the B topic here, which is trade and this relationship and this choice at this point. So we have a question from Newton de Mello, who was asking very specifically on if like the microelectronics industry is a possible area of cooperation, seeing how China actually prepared itself. We also have questions in terms of this discomfort between the political relationship, whether it can affect trade. So on that, so let's look at the situation here. Brazil and US in trade are actually, in fact, competitors in many, its main for Brazil's main sales pitches. So basically in trade, how can and where is it that the cooperation is possible, and what are the elements in trade that we can sort of like push forward between, to align this relationship, considering that these two countries are actually competitors in a lot of senses around the world. Brian.
Yeah, I'll just be really brief on this. There's a lot of discussion right now in not only in Washington, but in Mexico and in Central America about the possibilities offered by nearshoring. This idea that with factory production moving from Asia back to the Western Hemisphere, that there's opportunities for countries around the region. And let's think about the term, it's nearshoring. And so it's much more clear to me and a lot of people that that's a potential benefit for countries in the Northern Hemisphere than it is for countries in the Southern Hemisphere. So I was surprised when in a recent conversation with a senior US policymaker, Brazil was mentioned as a prominent piece of the puzzle. Because if the objective is nearshoring, Brazil is not particularly near. As someone who has put together lots of frequent flyer miles over the last 20 years, shuttling back and forth between the two countries, I can personally verify that's true. But the point was, this person said, look, Brazil has arguably the second most complex industrial base in the Western Hemisphere outside of northern Mexico. And therefore, we believe that there is an opportunity for Brazil to be part of this nearshoring story, that factory production that's being moved out of Asia could actually be, done in the region. I've asked people for examples of areas where Brazil could be, part of that story. One example that gets cited to me often is munitions, which I know people have ambiguous feelings about, but there is a need for that in the world, like it or not. And so that's one example that I've heard people in Washington talking about as an area where perhaps Brazil would have room to gain.
And Monica, if you look at the situation in trade, but also address sort of a tangential question, is whether the U.S.-Brazil relationship, this bilateral relationship, getting more traction, and what OECD session could impact either way, or if Brazil needs the U.S. to actually get that, because having OECD stamp helps in several ways, right? And being seen in the world, especially in the Trade Department.
It helps in several ways, and it creates several problems also. So I don't see this government moving in that direction. So but I would like to add to what Brian is saying, not in any way wanting to get into an economic discussion, but this is a government in Brazil with a project for reindustrialization, and without the resources to actually go about doing it. And it's really very dependent in terms of its success for employment, and for economic success to, at least in some areas, move ahead. And I think that is where the interests, both interests that Brian mentioned, but also other interests in terms of satellites and other areas of more sophisticated technology, that the bio industry, where there is strong interest in Brazil. And I think there could be, if leaders are able to actually talk about this and create projects to move ahead in terms of, there is also the whole debate on energy transition, where of course these two countries can cooperate and share resources. There is, of course, within the context of the broader dispute between the U.S. and China, a whole debate about lithium and other resources needed for the transition, for the energy transition. So I think if we think in terms of the energy transition, of course, there are immense opportunities for China as well. But I know that this is a core interest of the American government. It's, of course, a core interest of the Colombian government. And I think that particularly having Marina Silva in the government, we will have investment in this area. I think we should be looking at energy transition as a core area of cooperation between the two countries.
Yeah, which brings us to the fourth topic that we ended, which is the environment, right? Which is the fourth topic that was raised during the CEBRI and U.S. consulate project. So the environment, you say, there's also an area where the two current leaders, Biden and Lula, share some common ground here. Both of them have, came in to office with an environmental platform. So what we just have the 500 million announced, which was interesting timing there. But on the actual collaboration, practical and elements of like sustainable energy and all that, China is still like the largest producer of solar panels, the largest producer of wind farms. Anyway, so what are the areas that US and Brazil can actually collaborate, is just join forces and help these two, the climate crisis that is global, but these two countries have a role. One has the Amazon, The one is a high pollutant, the other is a high pollutant. So where are the options for these countries to collaborate in a meaningful way? Brian?
In 30 seconds or less. I think, because I think we're supposed to conclude at the bottom of the hour, aren't we?
No, we actually have 10 more minutes.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, that's good. So I have more than 30 seconds. That's good to hear. Look, I'm not a specialist on the environmental issue. My sense is that I know that there's a strong belief in both capitals that these governments can work together. I can't speak, in much detail about the technical aspects of that. I know that, climate change and the green energy transition have been priorities for the Biden administration. Lula, it's interesting. I think it's going to be a challenge to, rein in deforestation. And this is something that in Washington is not always fully appreciated. I have no one doubts Lula's political will on this subject, nor does anyone question the record of success that his government had in reducing deforestation by 75% the first time around. But look, this is another area where things are very different in the Brazil of today, as evidenced by the areas where the most intense deforestation happened over the last few years are the areas that voted most strongly for Jair Bolsonaro in the last election. And in a context where there's not a lot of political will on the ground in some of these areas to reduce deforestation, and where it's not clear how committed the security forces in Brazil are to that objective either, it may be more challenging than some people appreciate, both inside and outside Brazil, to get deforestation headed in the right direction again. I know that there's, issues, things like satellite monitoring, intelligence, remembering that, of course, a lot of what happens on the ground in terms of deforestation is caused by organized crime. That's an area where the U.S. may be able to contribute technical and intelligence resources, but it's not going to be easy. And I'm not sure that everybody in Washington understands that.
Can I just take one small point that Brian mentioned and bring it to the table? You mentioned security forces. We may wonder, are the security forces actually interested in fighting deforestation? And I think that the U.S. can play a crucial role here, because the security forces, the police and the army, see cooperation with the United States in very favorable terms, see it as a huge advantage. So if we can put these two together, cooperation, they need the technology, the resources, the training, and they very much appreciate it when it comes from the U.S. Perhaps even this had an influence in their attitude towards the attempt of a coup d'etat in Brazil. And I think that if the U.S. can cooperate with security forces in Brazil, gearing them towards this work, it would be a great thing.
That's true, although there are certainly political sensitivities around outsiders, and particularly outside soldiers, telling Brazil and the Brazilian military what to do in the Amazon.
Very sensitive.
That's a delicate subject.
While we do have, in fact, tons of armed people that are not from the Brazilian government who are actually roaming around. So I think these two countries are dealing with the impacts of organized crime, which I think that is the one elephant in the room that is impacted the entire region and creating instability across the board, right? And for the U.S. is the recipient side, right? Getting from the opioid damage to the weapons crisis. I mean, there are multiple crises that actually come back here to bite. So these two countries have a lot to discuss. I just want to go quickly through, because we have questions, but as well as comments from people here. So I want to read some of these questions and comments and have you both comment on them. So one of them raised, I don't usually like to read people that don't sign the questions, but this one is interesting because it's raising the fact that the U.S. is going to an electoral process next year. So that is one source of impact. Then we have Victor de Souza that is raising the fact that BRICS is a high priority for Brazil. We did mention that before. And earlier on, Newton de Mello also raised the issue that Russia is very strategic for Brazil because of fertilizer. Even though it's not a large trade partner, it sells to Brazil what it needs to be, its most profitable industry. So these are topics that, the election in the US and this links that Brazil has further to BRICS and Russia. Do any of these elements actually raise your radar or lights on your radar about the impacting the relationship with Brazil, thwarting or maybe delaying further discussions?
I think it's important to focus on the BRICS and where the BRICS will go. And I think where the BRICS, how this grouping will be redesigned, who will be added, will Argentina be added? Other countries are being considered. And what will be the focus of this grouping? It is, of course, the Lula government made very clear that their prime interest is investment and development, and they placed Dilma Rousseff at the center of this part of the project. But will the BRICS grouping actually be an important agent in making the world more multipolar? This is really not clear to me. I mean, if there is more democracy or at least multipolarity within the BRICS, perhaps the BRICS will not be that important for China and particularly for China in terms of building their place in the world. You have, of course, a regionalization of international politics that is to be considered. The BRICS are not a region. And this can be seen in both Chinese and Russian foreign policies. So I'm not sure that the BRICS, in terms of high politics, in terms of the distribution of power in the world, will actually be such an important element. And again, the focus of the Brazilian government, I think, will be development projects and not so much using the BRICS for a multipolar project. So in terms of the BRICS, I would very much focus on the very, very different relationships between these countries. There is, though, Cecilia, another issue that we did not mention that I would like to mention in terms of Brazil becoming or maybe trying to move towards a more central role, which is, and you mentioned the Amazon, but I think we need to remember that the government has been speaking about coordinating policies for the protection of the forests in Latin America, but not only in Latin America, also with Congo and Indonesia. And I think that is also an area to look and pay attention to.
Where the US could also contribute possibly and support. Brian, I just see, on your assessment that Brazil's multipolar view of the world, or trying to achieve that, not being understood. We have a question also from Carlos Guimarães, whether this multipolar position, whether, if it is a multipolar world, if it is in Brazil position vis-a-vis the US, in reality more an anti-American philosophical position within the PT. It's the president's party, and Celso Amorim, given his influence, being an influential voice in international relations with him. And how does that sit with this in this discussion here?
Look, I think that there is some anti-Americanism to be found within the PT and within this government. But I don't find it to be the main explanation for this search for multipolarity, in part because, as I noted, virtually every major Latin American government is looking right now for some version of this philosophy. You know, it's interesting to me on this question about BRICS and some of the other things that we're talking about, how difficult it is to understand what the true priorities are for this government, the Brazilian government, on foreign policy. I mean, listen to us, right? We've been talking about BRICS, and we've been talking about the Amazon and Ukraine and China and Russia. And one of the more salient criticisms that I've heard of this government's foreign policy is that they have at least publicly not expressed kind of what the hierarchy of priorities are. In the interview, which someone mentioned earlier that I recently did with Foreign Minister Mauro Vieira, and I asked him what the Lula doctrine was, and I'll paraphrase here, but it was something to the effect of rebuilding our relationships in the world and talking with everybody. But it has sometimes led to some strategic confusion that you also hear in other capitals. Let me give you an example. In some of my recent travels, I heard confusion about the Lula government's apparent desire to revitalize UNASUR. A lot of people, including in leftist governments, so it's not a left-right thing, in otherwise ideologically sympathetic governments around the region, people are asking why do we want to revive UNASUR, and can we even revive UNASUR, given the possibility that the next president of Argentina will probably not be someone on the left, and therefore will not have an interest in rejoining this bloc, which of course fell apart in large part because it became associated with just one point on the ideological spectrum. Why not embrace CELAC instead as a pan-Latin American bloc? So anyway, lots of unanswered questions out there.
Indeed.
Despite our efforts today.
And Biden, the candidate, how much attention is he going to be paying attention in the next year or so to Latin America, let alone Brazil? So final considerations. I want to give you both 2 minutes to sort of a final consideration. Where do you think, maybe I'll pose a question, where next are Biden and Lula going to meet? Is this in the cards coming up? Monica, your final words then. You're on mute, sorry.
Sorry. I would just like to return to the fact that we need to find the right position, the right social spaces for the debate on the support for democracy. I think that it will be, and I hope it will be, a crucial aspect of the bilateral relationship, and it cannot be everywhere. It has to find its own specific space, moment, when it can actually be fruitful, when we can actually move ahead in terms of supporting democracy. And I would really, I hope that very, very soon the presidents meet again, perhaps for a longer visit. It would be quite incredible if the American president visited us, and we could show our how thankful we are for the manner in which he supported the stability of our democracy. And I think we should not forget that.
See, this is
not the largest trade partner, but the largest investor in Brazil as well, right? Right. Your
well, you know, speaking of a potential visit, I mean, this is the challenge President Biden is going to have for the rest of his time in power, whether that's 1 year or another 5 years, which is everybody's going to say, like, look, Mr. President, if you had 5 days for Ireland, can't you make 1 or 2 days for Brazil? But that's an issue he's going to have to deal with. Look, I again would just reiterate 1 or 2 comments that I made at the introduction. It's a broad, nuanced, interest-based relationship, lots of capillarity between the countries, not only at the government-to-government level, but with tourism, investment, so on. And that's why, even during times when the match between leaders is difficult, as it was during the stretch when President Biden and President Bolsonaro overlapped. There were still aspects of the relationship that sort of defied gravity, if you will, and seemed to move forward nonetheless. At the same time, I would recognize that, as I also said, it is a delicate moment right now. I think that there are people in both capitals who would cheer a distancing between the two countries and who are pushing in that direction. And it's not always a question of ideology or of party. You sort of find those people everywhere. And some of it's going to be dictated by the relationship between Washington and Brasilia, and some of it's going to be dictated by bigger things that happened in the world, on everything from China and potentially Taiwan to bigger questions in Europe. So as I said at the beginning, life is never boring for those of us who work in this space, and I'm sure that the next few months will continue to bring surprises.
Indeed it will. Well, Brian, Monica, thank you so much. Luciana, this is fantastic. Thank you so much for having me here moderating, and just hope that everyone, checks out the CEBRI website, and also America's Quarterly. Our new issue is out today exactly on Brazil's foreign policy. So I hope everybody watches and everyone has a wonderful night. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cecilia. Cecilia, you did a great job. You brought back together to our event today all the topics that we have been discussing along the past 2 years. I don't know how you managed to do that with the lack of time that we have. Thank you so much. Monica and Brian, thanks so much for accepting our invitation to joining us and for such a fruitful discussion. Today is the last panel of our project with the U.S. Consulate, but I think we all have the feeling that there's a lot more to discuss on the upcoming month and years. So stay tuned with CEBRI's website. We'll be doing a lot of events. We'll be launching the project reports by the end of this month. So, and also would like to thank our audience. Thank you so much for joining us today. And the last and very special thanks to the U.S. Consulate here in Rio de Janeiro. Thank you to the Consul General Jacqueline Ward. Thank you to Carla and to Mark Carr, who have been working with us. It has been a pleasure and an honor to develop this project with you. And a final thanks to CEBRI's team, to Barbara, and to all the events team who helped us to put this together. Thank you all for being together with us until now. Good night. Bye-bye.
Boa noite.